In 1971, on a wooden dock along a tidal creek on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, a Gullah woman named Miss Evelina threw a cast net in a perfect circle at low tide. She pulled in enough shrimp for the evening rice pot. She had done this every afternoon for 40 years. By 1989, a resort developer owned that creek. The dock was gone, the net was in a closet, and 25 dishes that had survived the Middle Passage, survived 200 years on the Sea Islands, and survived Jim Crow could not survive a golf course. Number 7 connected South Carolina directly to Sierra Leone. Number 18 was a cut of meat that nobody else wanted. Number 11 fed whole communities from a single cast net haul. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 Gullah Geechee dishes that disappeared after the 1980s. Number 25, smoked mullet over rice. This was the dish that said, "The creek will feed you if you pay attention." On Sapelo Island, Georgia, Gullah families caught mullet with cast nets at low tide and hung them on wooden racks over smoldering oak and palmetto. The smoking went on for hours. The smell drifted across the whole community. Your neighbor knew supper was coming. Once smoked, the mullet was flaked apart and laid over white rice cooked the Gullah way, each grain separate, never sticky. A squeeze of lemon, maybe a handful of green onion. That was the whole plate. The technique came straight from West Africa, where fish smoking was one of the oldest preservation methods known. When the mullet ran in the fall, your grandmother smoked enough to last through winter. By the 1990s, resort development cut off access to the tidal creeks, where families had netted mullet for generations. The smoking racks came down. The recipe went with them. Number 24, Beni seed soup. This was a bowl of medicine that tasted like forgiveness. Beni is the Gullah word for sesame, and the seed came to the Sea Islands tucked into the hair and clothing of enslaved Africans from the Windward Coast. They planted Beni in small garden plots beside the cabin. The soup started with roasted Ben seeds, ground into a paste, then stirred into a pot of simmering collard greens with a smoked turkey neck at the bottom. It cooked low and slow until the broth turned creamy and nutsy. Your spoon hit the bottom and came up thick. In the Wolof and Bambara languages of West Africa, Beni meant a plan of good luck. The soup was served to the sick, the grieving, and anyone whose spirit needed rebuilding. By the late 1980s, the old heirloom Ben plants were nearly extinct. Commercial sesame had replaced them, and it did not taste the same. The soup lost its flavor. Then it lost its people. Number 23, shark and grits. This dish frightened people who didn't grow up on the water. Gullah fishermen on Dafuski Island caught small blacktip and bonnet-head sharks in the inshore waters. They filleted the shark, soaked it overnight in buttermilk to pull out the ammonia, then fried it crisp in a cast iron skillet and served it over stone ground grits with a vinegar pepper sauce. The meat was firm and white. It tasted nothing like what you imagine. Your plate cost almost nothing because nobody else wanted the catch. Gullah cooks understood that the ocean does not rank its offerings. Everything that swims has a purpose. By the mid-1980s, recreational fishing charters had taken over the inshore waters around Hilton Head and Dafuski. The Gullah fishermen lost access to the same channels their families had worked for 2 centuries. The shark stopped coming to the table. Number 22, conch stew. This was a pot that took all day and fed you for a week. On the Georgia Sea Islands, Gullah families gathered conch from the shallow tidal flats during spring low tides. The meat was tough until you knew what to do with it. Your grandmother pounded it with a mallet, then stewed it in a heavy pot with tomatoes, onion, hot pepper, and a splash of vinegar. It went for 4 hours on a low fire. The conch turned to tender, and the broth turned into something that made you close your eyes. In West Africa, similar shellfish stews had fed coastal communities for centuries. On the sea islands, conch stew was working food. You ate it before you went oystering at dawn. By the 1990s, overharvesting and environmental changes made conch scarce around Sapelo and St. Simons. The flats that had provided for generations went quiet. Number 21, cooter pie. The name alone made outsiders uncomfortable. Cooter is the Gullah word for freshwater turtle, and the word traces back to the Bambara language of West Africa. On Johns Island, South Carolina, Gullah families trapped cooters in the ponds and slow-moving creeks. The meat was cleaned, stewed until tender, then baked inside a deep dish pie crust with hard-boiled eggs, potatoes, and a heavy hand of black pepper. Your family didn't eat this on any ordinary night. Cooter pie was a gathering dish. It showed up at praise house meetings and at funerals. Making it required skill because the turtle had to be cleaned precisely or the meat turned bitter. By the 1980s, younger generations had moved to Charleston and Savannah. The elders who knew how to trap and clean a cooter were disappearing. The ponds were being drained for development. The pie left the table and did not come back. Number 20, oyster purlieu. If you haven't heard the word purlieu, you haven't been listening to the right people. Purlieu is the Gullah word for pilau, a one-pot rice dish cooked with whatever the day provided. On St. Helena Island, the day often provided oysters. Families gathered them from the creek beds at low tide, shucked them on the bank, and carried them home in sweetgrass baskets. The purlieu started with onion and garlic in a heavy pot, then rice, then broth, then the oysters went in at the end so they didn't turn to rubber. The whole dish took less than 30 minutes. It fed 6 people for the price of your labor and your knowledge of the tides. One pot, local ingredients, African technique, every grain of rice separate. By the late 1980s, commercial oyster harvesting and pollution from resort runoff had destroyed many of the creek beds where families had gathered for generations. The purlieu survived in memory. The oyster beds did not. Number 19, groundnut stew. This dish did not have to travel far to reach the sea islands. It was already waiting. Groundnut is the Gullah word for peanut, and the stew is one of the most direct connections between Gullah cooking and West Africa. In Sierra Leone and Senegal, groundnut stew, called mafe or domoda, was a staple of daily life. On the sea islands, Gullah women made it with roasted peanuts, ground into a thick paste, stirred into a pot with chicken, tomatoes, okra, and hot pepper. The stew was rich and heavy. It sat in your stomach like a warm hand. Your bowl came with rice on the side, always rice, because in Gullah, life a meal without rice was not a meal. When Sierra Leone's President Joseph Momo visited Penn Center on St. Helena Island in 1988, he tasted the local food and said he thought he was back home. That was not a compliment, that was a confirmation. 250 years apart and the stew still tasted the same. By the 1990s, the women who had learned this recipe from their own grandmothers were growing old. Their grandchildren had moved to Atlanta, to Charlotte, to New York. The stew waited on the stove for someone who didn't come home. Number 18, crab rice. This was the dish that proved you came from somewhere. On the sea islands, blue crabs were so plentiful that children caught them off the dock with a chicken neck on a string. Your grandmother picked the crab meat by hand, every piece, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl and a butter knife. She did not rush, she could not rush, because a single piece of shell would ruin the whole pot. The rice went into a heavy cast iron pot with onion, tomato, green pepper, and the picked crab meat folded in at the end. It cooked covered until the steam did its work. The Gullah called this kind of cooking unu, meaning doing things the way your people have always done them. This wasn't a recipe you looked up. This was a recipe that lived in your hands. Every island had its own version. Dalfuski crab rice tasted different from Edisto, and both tasted different from Sapelo. The differences were small. The pride was enormous. By the late 1980s, the blue crab population had declined sharply. Resort development had polluted the estuaries. Docks where children once dangled chicken necks were private property. The crab rice did not vanish because people forgot how to make it. It vanished because the crabs did. Number 17, Potlikker greens with cornmeal dumplings. This was the meal that stretched nothing into enough. Potlikker is the liquid left after you cook collard greens or turnip greens with a piece of smoked meat. Most kitchens threw it away. Gullah kitchens saved every drop. Your grandmother added cornmeal dumplings to the simmering green broth and let them puff up soft and dense. The dumplings absorbed the smoky liquid until they were heavy with flavor. A bowl cost almost nothing. The greens came from the garden. The smoked neck bone came from the cheapest section of the butcher. The cornmeal was always in the pantry. On the Sea Islands, this was a Tuesday night. It was ordinary, and it kept people alive through winters that would have broken a weaker kitchen. The dish lost ground when younger families left the gardens behind and the greens started coming from cans. Number 16, sweet potato pone. This was not a pie. Do not confuse the two. Sweet potato pone was a dense, heavy, almost bread-like dish baked in a cast iron skillet until the top cracked and caramelized. Gullah cooks on Edisto Island grated raw sweet potatoes by hand, mixed them with cane syrup, butter, ginger, and nutmeg, then baked it low and slow until it pulled away from the sides of the pan. You didn't eat this with a fork. You cut it into squares and ate it with your hands. It was breakfast. It was dessert. It was whatever you needed it to be. The sweet potato had deep African roots. Enslaved people recognized it as a cousin to the yam they had known in West Africa. On the Sea Islands, pone was a harvest dish, made in the fall when the potatoes came out of the ground. By the 1990s, the small farms where families had grown their own sweet potatoes were being sold to developers. No garden meant no harvest. No harvest meant no pone. Number 15, raccoon and sweet potato stew. This one will test your comfort, but if you grew up on the Sea Islands before the resorts arrived, you didn't blink at a raccoon in the pot. Gullah families on Johns Island and Wadmalaw Island hunted raccoon in the fall and winter. The meat was soaked in salt water, then slow stewed with sweet potatoes, onions, and bay leaf until it fell apart. The flavor was dark and gamey and rich. Your plate spoke to a time when the woods were your grocery store and nothing that walked through them went to waste. Raccoon stew was practical. It was free. By the mid-1980s, the woods on these islands were being cleared for gated communities and golf courses. The hunting grounds shrank. The stew became a story instead of a supper. Number 14, okra soup with shrimp heads. This was the dish where nothing was wasted and everything mattered. When Gullah shrimpers brought their catch home, the heads were separated from the tails. The tails went to market. The heads went into the soup pot. Your grandmother knew that all the flavor lived in the head. She simmered them until the broth turned orange and rich, then strained the shells and added sliced okra, tomatoes, and onion. The okra thickened the soup naturally. No flour, no ruse, just the okra doing what okra was born to do. This technique came straight from West Africa, where okra-based soups had been a foundation of cooking for centuries. The Gullah word for okra soup was gombo, the same word that became gumbo in Louisiana. On the Sea Islands, this was a weeknight meal. It was not special, it was just how your people cooked. By the late 1980s, small shrimping operations run by Gullah families were being squeezed out by commercial trawlers and rising dock fees. When the shrimp heads stopped coming home, the soup stopped simmering. Number 13, red peas and rice. This is not the same as Hoppin' John. Don't let anyone tell you it is. Red peas and rice used a specific variety of small red field pea that Gullah families had grown on the Sea Islands for generations. The seed stock traced directly back to West Africa. The peas were simmered with smoked pork until they turned soft and creamy, then served over rice cooked in a separate pot. The two came together on the plate, not in the pot. That distinction mattered. Your grandmother served this on Thursdays and Saturdays, the regular days, the days nobody wrote about. The red pea was smaller, nuttier, and earthier than a black-eyed pea. It tasted like the soil it came from. By the 1990s, the heirloom seed stock was nearly gone. Families who had saved seed for generations left the islands. The fields went to brush. The peas went to memory. Number 12, mullet roe and grits. This was the breakfast that nobody outside the Sea Islands understood. During the fall mullet run, Gullah fishermen prized the roe above the fish itself. The egg sacs were carefully removed, salted lightly, then pan-fried in bacon grease until the outside crisped and the inside stayed creamy. It went straight onto a plate of hot grits. The flavor was briny and rich, somewhere between the ocean and the earth. Your plate told you exactly where you lived. Mullet roe had been a prized food along the West African coast for centuries. On the Sea Islands, you ate it in October and November when the mullet were fat and full. You couldn't buy this in a store. You had to catch it, clean it, and cook it yourself. That was the price. By the late 1980s, the mullet runs had thinned. Commercial netting and habitat loss cut the population. The RO became harder to find than the memory of it. Number 11, pine bark fish stew. The name had nothing to do with pine bark. Nobody's sure where the name came from, though some believe it referred to the color of the broth. On the Sea Islands and across the low country, Gullah families made this stew with whatever fresh fish the day provided: bream, catfish, whiting, mullet. The fish went into a heavy pot with layers. First a layer of sliced potatoes, then onions, then the fish, then tomatoes, then more potatoes, more onions, more fish, more tomatoes. It stacked up like a family history. The pot went over a low fire and cooked without stirring for hours. The layers melted into each other. The broth turned the color of old brick. A single pot of pine bark stew could feed 20 people at a fish fry, a praise house gathering, or a funeral repast. This was the dish that held a community together in the worst and best moments of its life. The stew was always cooked by the eldest women, the ones who could feel when the pot was done by the sound it made. There was no timer, there was no thermometer. There was just a woman who had been listening to that pot for 60 years and knew its voice the way she knew her own children's voices. She did not teach the recipe with words. She taught it by standing beside her daughter at the stove and saying, "Not yet, now." By the 1990s, the praise houses on St. Helena Island had dwindled from 25 to fewer than 5. The gathering shrank. The eldest women passed on. The heavy pots went into closets, and a stew that had once fed an entire island sat in the memory of people who could still taste it but could not find anyone left to cook it. Number 10, Frogmore stew. Don't call it a low country boil unless you want to erase where it came from. Frogmore stew takes its name from the community of Frogmore on St. Helena Island, the heart of Gullah culture in the South Carolina Sea Islands. A large pot of salted water came to a rolling boil. In went small red potatoes, then corn broken into pieces, then smoked sausage, and finally shrimp still in the shell. Old Bay seasoning wasn't part of the original recipe. The original Gullah version used salt, black pepper, and hot pepper from the garden. The stew was drained and poured directly onto a newspaper-covered table. Everyone gathered around and ate with their hands. There were no plates, there was no formality. By the late 1980s, resort culture had renamed this dish the Low Country Boil and turned it into a tourist attraction. The name Frogmore was scrubbed away. The community that created it was being pushed off the island by rising property taxes and developers buying Hare's property. They took the name, they took the recipe. They didn't take the people. Number 9, Benny wafers. These thin, golden, crisp discs weren't cookies. They were a prayer made solid. Gullah women roasted heirloom Benny seeds in a dry skillet until they popped and filled the kitchen with a nutty, almost burnt honey smell. The seeds were folded into a batter of butter, sugar, egg, flour, and salt. Spoonfuls were dropped onto a baking sheet and baked until paper thin and crackling. In the Gullah tradition, Bene was the goodwill plant. Eating Bene brought good fortune. Your family served these wafers at weddings, at New Year gatherings, at the turn of any season that needed a blessing. The heirloom seed was the soul of this wafer. It was smaller, darker, and richer than the commercial sesame that replaced it. The old variety had been passed from family to family, garden to garden, for 200 years. By the 1990s, most of those garden lines had broken. Tourist shops in Charleston sold something called a Benny wafer, but it was made with commercial sesame. It looked the same. It tasted like a stranger. Number 8, oxtail over rice. This was the cut of meat that patience turned into treasure. On the Sea Islands, oxtail was the cheapest thing at the butcher's counter because it was mostly bone and connective tissue. Nobody with money wanted it, but your grandmother didn't see a cheap cut. She saw a challenge. The oxtails were browned in a heavy pot, then braised for 3 to 4 hours with onion, garlic, tomato, and thyme until the meat slid off the bone and the marrow melted into the gravy. It went over a plate of white rice and the gravy soaked into every grain. This was a dish that couldn't be rushed. There was no shortcut. The thyme was the ingredient. On Edisto Island, oxtail over rice was a Saturday afternoon dish because only Saturday gave you enough hours to do it right. Your kitchen filled with the smell that pulled the neighbors to the window. It was the smell of collagen breaking down, of marrow releasing, of a pot that had been working since noon and still wasn't finished. The gravy thickened on its own. The meat fell apart at the touch of a spoon. By the time the pot was ready, your grandmother had peeled and chopped the vegetables, washed the rice, set the table, told 2 stories, and corrected 3 grandchildren. The oxtail waited for her. It always did. That was the understanding between a Gullah cook and her pot. You give it time, it gives you everything. By the 1980s, oxtail prices had risen as Caribbean and Asian markets discovered what Gullah cooks had always known. What was once a throwaway cut became expensive. The people who had turned it into art couldn't afford it anymore. Time equals 1 second / greater than number 7, neck bones and field peas. This was the meal that proved you didn't need much to feel whole. Smoked pork neck bones cost pennies at the butcher shops in Beaufort and Georgetown, South Carolina. Gullah cooks simmered them in a pot of water until the smoky flavor bled out and the broth turned dark. Field peas, the small dried peas that Gullah families had grown and saved seed from for generations, went into the broth and cooked until they softened into a thick, creamy stew. The peas and the bones fed each other. The bones gave flavor. The peas gave body. A single pot cost less than $1 and fed a family for 2 days. On the Sea Islands, this was the meal you ate between paydays. It was the meal that waited for you when nothing else would. Your grandmother didn't call it poverty food. She called it supper. She put it on the table with a cloth napkin and a glass of sweet tea and her hand on the back of your chair for a moment before she sat down. By the late 1980s, the field peas that made this dish what it was had become hard to find. The old seed-saving families had scattered. The commercial peas cooked differently. They tasted differently. The dish remained on paper, but the soul of it had moved on. Number 6, salt pork and lima bean perlou. This turned 2 pantry ingredients into a complete world. Salt pork was always in the Gullah kitchen. It was the anchor of almost every pot. The pork was sliced thin, rendered until the fat ran clear. Then onion, rice, and dried lima beans went in with water and cooked covered until the rice absorbed everything. The lima beans turned soft and buttery. The salt pork pieces crisped at the edges where they met the bottom of the pot. Your spoon scraped those crispy bits first. Every time, the perlou was a one-pot meal in the truest sense. One pot, one fire, one set of hands. Gullah women on Hilton Head made this regularly before the resort development of the 1960s and 1970s. After the developers arrived, roughly 300 Gullah families were forced off the island. Their family burial grounds ended up behind million-dollar condominiums. The perlou was one of hundreds of daily meals that vanished when the kitchens that made them were torn down. Number 5, stewed garlic crabs. This dish smelled like the entire Sea Island coast had crawled into your kitchen. Gullah families on St. Helena and Ladies Island caught blue crabs in wire traps or by hand in the tidal creeks. The crabs were cleaned, cracked, then stewed whole with garlic, tomato, onion, and hot pepper. The shells turned red. The garlic melted into the broth. You ate this with your hands, pulling the crab apart and sucking the garlic broth from the shells. There wasn't a polite way to eat stewed garlic crabs. Your shirt was ruined, your fingers were stained, and you didn't care because the flavor justified every mess you made. Your grandmother cooked by feel, by smell, by the sound. The pot made when it was ready. That kind of knowledge can't be written down. It has to be inherited. By the 1990s, the Tidal Creek access that had sustained Gullah crabbing for generations was blocked by private development. The crab traps came up empty. The garlic crabs went quiet. Number 4, Sapelo Island cornbread. This wasn't yellow, it wasn't sweet, and it wasn't made with flour. On Sapelo Island, Georgia, the last intact saltwater Geechee community on Earth, cornbread was made from stone ground, white cornmeal, water, salt, and a little lard. That was the entire recipe. The batter was thin and poured into a screaming hot cast iron skillet greased with pork fat. It baked until the edges were lace crisp and the center was dense and barely set. You broke it with your hands and dropped it into a bowl of whatever was on the stove: potlikker, fish stew, okra soup. The cornbread was not a side dish. It was a tool. It soaked up the broth and carried the flavor to your mouth. Sapelo cornbread was different from mainland cornbread because the community was different. The island had remained almost completely isolated until the mid-20th century. The food hadn't been changed by outside influence. By the 1990s, the population of Hog Hammock, the last Gullah community on Sapelo, had fallen below 70 people. The kitchens were closing one by one. Number 3, pigfoot souse. This was a dish that required you to rethink everything you believed about food. On the Sea Islands, pig feet were the cheapest part of the hog. Your grandmother bought them for pennies. She boiled them until the collagen melted and the meat fell from the bone, then set it all in a bowl with sliced onion, hot pepper, vinegar, and salt. It went into the icebox overnight. By morning, the collagen had set into a firm, clear jelly with pieces of tender pork suspended inside. You sliced it cold and ate it for breakfast or as a snack on a hot day. The vinegar cut through the richness. Sauce was a preservation technique that African cooks had used for generations before it reached the sea islands. The vinegar acted as a natural preservative. On Dalfuski Island, families made sauce after hog killing day in December and ate from it through the holidays. By the mid-1980s, the hog killing tradition had nearly disappeared. The small farms were gone. The knowledge of butchering and preserving left with the elders. Number 2, Hoppin' John with smoked neck. This was New Year on the Sea Islands, and it wasn't negotiable. Hoppin' John is a dish of rice and field peas, and the Gullah version was the original. The name may come from a Gullah pronunciation, or it may come from something older that nobody wrote down. What matters is what went into the pot. Dried field peas simmered with a smoked pork neck bone until the peas were tender and the broth was thick. The rice cooked separately, each grain dry and distinct. Then the peas and broth were ladled over the top, collard greens on the side. The peas meant good luck. The greens meant money. The rice meant abundance. Your family ate this on January 1st without exception. Missing Hoppin' John on New Year was like missing your own name being called. The tradition was older than the country it was eaten in. By the 1990s, the heirloom field pea varieties that gave Hoppin' John its particular taste were vanishing. Families who had saved seed for 2 centuries could no longer tend their gardens. The commercial peas made a similar dish, but similar is not the same. The elders knew the difference. Number 1, Reezy Peasy. This was the last dish standing. The final word in Gullah kitchen simplicity, Reezy Peasy, was nothing more than rice and field peas cooked together in one pot. That was it. The name itself was Gullah language, a playful shortening that rolled off the tongue the way the dish rolled off the spoon. It wasn't Hoppin' John because the peas and rice cooked together from the start, absorbing each other, becoming one thing instead of two. Your grandmother made Reezy Peasy on the nights when there was nothing else. A handful of dried peas, a cup of rice, water, salt, a piece of salt pork if the pantry was generous. The pot did the rest. This dish had survived the Middle Passage. It had survived 2 centuries on islands that the rest of America forgot existed. It was the purest African retention in American cooking, a direct descendant of the rice and bean dishes that fed West African families for 1,000 years before a single ship left the coast. Reezy Peasy didn't disappear because it was complicated. It disappeared because the people who made it lost their land, lost their access to the water, lost their children to cities that promised more than the island could give. The recipe is still simple: a pot of rice, a handful of peas, but the hands that knew how to make it sing, the kitchens where the pot sat on the same stove for 3 generations, the voice that said, "Come eat," in a language that America tried to erase, those are what vanished. The recipe survived. The world it belonged to didn't. Number 15, molasses pulled candy. This was porch candy and kitchen candy, made in black church kitchens and Sunday school rooms across the South decades before mass-produced sweets took over. A woman in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, boiled molasses with a little butter and vinegar until it reached the hard, cracked stage on a candy thermometer she did not own. She tested it by dropping a bead into cold water and watching it snap. Then she buttered her hands and pulled the hot candy in long ropes, stretching and folding it over and over until it turned from dark brown to a pale golden color. She cut the ropes into pieces and wrapped them in wax paper. The candy was sticky, rich, and tasted like burnt sugar and earth. Molasses appeared so often in Black American food because it was the byproduct of the sugar refining process given to enslaved people as a cheap sweetener. This candy carried that history in every bite. By the 1970s, store-bought candy replaced the pull. Nobody stood on the porch pulling taffy anymore. Number 23, watermelon rind pickles. Your grandmother did not throw away the rind. She peeled off the green skin, cut the white flesh into cubes, and soaked them overnight in salt water. The next day, she boiled them in a syrup of sugar, vinegar, cinnamon sticks, and cloves until the cubes turned translucent and sweet. She packed them into mason jars and sealed them with paraffin wax. In the 1960s, jars of watermelon rind pickles showed up at every reunion table in the Deep South. A jar cost almost nothing to make because the rind was garbage to everyone else. By the 1990s, the canning tradition had faded. Younger women did not own pressure canners, and watermelon came pre-cut in plastic containers from the grocery store with no rind attached. The raw material vanished. The skill vanished with it. Sunday mornings had their own smell, and in households that kept the tradition, that smell was salmon croquettes. The quiet sizzle of a shallow skillet, patties of canned pink salmon mixed with egg, onion, and crushed crackers, fried on both sides until golden and firm. Canned salmon was an affordable pantry staple in Black households from the 1940s onward, cheap enough to stretch a breakfast for six and rich enough to carry people through a long morning of church. Your grandmother didn't measure anything. She cracked the egg directly over the bowl, shook in the crackers by feel, added black pepper and sometimes mustard, and shaped the patties with wet palms. If they fell, apart in the pan, she told you your hands were too hot. The grits went on first, always simmering low while the croquettes fried. By the time the patties were done, the kitchen was full of steam and your plate was already half warm. Salmon croquettes with grits was the Sunday companion to the Saturday fish fry, a quieter discipline that required the same hands and the same knowledge. Number 18, fried corn. This was not corn on the cob, and it was not cream corn from a can. This was fresh corn cut from the cob with a sharp knife, then scraped with the back of the blade to get the milk out. A woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, fried that corn in bacon drippings with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar in a cast iron skillet until the edges turned brown and the natural sugars caramelized. The whole kitchen smelled like summer. You could make it in August when the corn was high, and only in August because this dish required corn so fresh it still had silk clinging to the husk. Canned corn could not do it. Frozen corn could not do it. The dish died when the gardens did. When Black families moved north during the Great Migration, they left behind the plots where sweet corn grew in rows behind the house, and fried corn became a memory of a place they could not get back to. Number 24, hog head cheese. This was not cheese. It didn't have anything to do with dairy. It was the face of a pig, slow simmered until every scrap of meat fell from the bone, then seasoned with vinegar, hot sauce, onion, and celery salt, pressed into a loaf pan and chilled until the natural gelatin set it solid. You sliced it cold and ate it on crackers or white bread. In rural Alabama, a man named Roosevelt Jenkins made it every family reunion from 1961 to 1979. He got the hog heads from a slaughterhouse outside Selma for 35 cents each. His children fought over the last slice. By the late 1980s, slaughterhouses stopped selling hog heads to walk-in customers. Industrial processing changed the supply chain, and the knowledge of how to clean a hog head, how to judge when the gelatin was right, that lived in the hands of people who were getting old. When they stopped, nobody picked it up. The women who got them right are gone. Whole bone-in fried whiting demanded something from you. It came out of the grease with the skin taut and mahogany dark, the flesh sweet beneath a fine cornmeal crust, and eating it was an act of engagement. Fingers in, bones navigated, the small firm meat of the cheek worth working for. In Black communities along the Atlantic seaboard, fried whiting was the fish, specific and unapologetic. Enslaved people from coastal West Africa were already practiced fishermen, and whiting, mild, affordable, easy to fry in quantity, fit that inheritance. By 1974, the Nation of Islam had contracted with a Peruvian distributor for 1 million pounds of whiting annually, sold door to door in Black neighborhoods, and a 1975 issue of Muhammad Speaks listed it as a Black household staple. The hot sauce that went on top was thin and sharp, cayenne cut with vinegar, nothing creamy. Fewer families fry whole fish at home now. The bones discourage people who didn't grow up learning to read them, and that particular reading is no longer taught. Number 16, blackberry dumplings. If you grew up in the rural South before 1980, you knew where the blackberry bushes were the way you knew where your own front door was. A woman in Wilcox County, Alabama, took her grandchildren out every June with 10 buckets, and they picked until their fingers were stained purple and their arms were scratched from the thorns. She simmered those berries with sugar and water until they made a thick, dark syrup, then dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough into the bubbling pot. The dumplings puffed up and soaked in the juice until they were soft on the inside and stained violet on the outside. One pot could feed 8 people. The berries were free. The flour cost a nickel. The whole thing was cheap and beautiful in a way that store-bought desserts never were. By the 1990s, most of those bushes had been cleared for development. The children who used to pick berries were grown and living in cities, and the dumplings stopped showing up at the homecoming table because nobody had the berries anymore. The bushes were gone. The buckets were gone. Number 22, crackling bread. This was cornbread with a secret. After a hog killing, the skin was rendered in a cast iron pot until the fat melted away and the skin crisped into golden, crunchy pieces called cracklings. You folded those cracklings into cornbread batter and baked it in a hot skillet greased with lard. Crispy on the outside, dense on the inside, with pockets of salty pork fat that melted on your tongue. In the 1950s, you could buy cracklings at any country store in Mississippi or Georgia for a few cents a bag. A woman in Yazoo City made crackling bread for every reunion from 1958 to 1981. She brought it wrapped in a flour sack towel inside a paper bag. By the mid-1980s, hog killings had all but stopped. Families moved to cities, supermarkets replaced the smokehouse, and without fresh cracklings, the bread was just cornbread. It was good, but it was not the same. Before the first piece of fish hit the oil, your job was hush puppies, cornmeal batter with onion, salt, and buttermilk, dropped by a spoonful into the same cast iron the fish had been frying in all afternoon. The grease carried everything that came before it: the catfish, the perch, the trace of cayenne from the last batch. That was the point. Hush puppies fried in fish grease are entirely different from hush puppies fried in clean oil. They absorb the richness and smoke of what came before them and arrive at the plate dense with a flavor that has no other name. In Southern Black communities, fried perch alongside hush puppies came the way Sunday came alongside church. One implied the other. Perch was smaller and sweeter than catfish, quicker to fry, popular in the river communities of Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, where families fished the same stretches of river their grandparents had fished. By the time the fish fry moved north with the Great Migration, perch stayed in some households and faded from others. The hush puppies made from leftover fish grease went with them. These 25 dishes weren't exotic. They were ordinary. They were Tuesday night on the Sea Islands. They were the food that Gullah Geechee families cooked with what the land and the water gave them, using techniques their ancestors carried across an ocean in their memory. When the resorts came, they didn't just take the land. They took the creeks where your family netted shrimp. They took the oyster beds where your grandmother gathered breakfast. They took the fields where your grandfather grew the peas that went into every pot. Try one of these dishes this week. Not to be adventurous, try it because these recipes are proof that the simplest food, cooked in one pot, served on a plain table, can carry the weight of an entire civilization. Tell me in the comments which dish your family still remembers. Tell me if your grandmother made reezy peasy or groundnut stew or something with a name you couldn't spell but could always taste. Because these aren't just recipes, they are evidence that a people stolen from their homeland built a kitchen so strong it took a golf course to finally knock it down.